A bill is a formal document produced during the legislative process, intended to meet specific constitutional and legislative requirements. A bill is a proposal to make new law or change existing law, and can be considered a working document, subject to change at almost any point during the legislative process.
An example of how a bill is a working document is that it could be amended. If the bill is given a hearing in a committee, a senator may wish to propose an amendment to the bill. When a bill is amended, the new language, the language in the amendment, gets rolled into the bill. And so the new language either is added to the bill or could supersede or overwrite some language that was in the bill. What happens after that point is the bill is engrossed. Engrossing is incorporating or rolling together any changes to a bill that were adopted by a committee. And so there will be a version of the bill as introduced, and then the engrossed version would be the next version of the bill as it was amended. And it's important when you're following along with the bill to make sure that you're following along with the correct version or engrossment of the bill, because they could change from one day or one committee hearing to another. And they could be very different, or there could be subtle differences that are still very important to the effect of the bill. The higher the number, the more recent the engrossment.
The course of a bill may change as it travels through the legislative process. Those changes may consist of language being added or subtracted, resulting in a document packed with an assortment of sections, subdivisions, titles, and other grammatical elements. For those new to the process, reading a bill or navigating through the legalese of a bill can be challenging, but there are ways to better understand what to look for and how to follow along.
Well, the first way to read a bill would be to look at the title. There's going to be generally what the bill is relating to. The first line is always a bill for an act. So it is a bill proposing to change some type of legislation. The next thing that you'll see is what the bill is relating to. So that'll be a very general topic, and under the Constitution, a bill can only relate to one subject. After that general subject will be particular subtopics about what the bill proposes to do. Then further down in the title of the bill are the sections of law that the bill proposes to amend. Following the title, if the bill is long or complex, the bill could be broken up into articles. And articles are very general signposts kind of that break the bill up into discrete subtopics. So for example, in an omnibus tax bill, an article would be Article 1, income tax, Article 2, sales and use tax. Within articles, there are sections. A section of a bill is where a statute or law is proposed to be amended, whether it be adding to or deleting language from existing law, or adding entirely new language, a new section of law, or repealing language. If it's a shorter bill or deals with just a couple of issues, the bill wouldn't be broken up into articles. However, a bill always has section numbers. So even if it is just one section of law, a couple lines of changed language, there's always going to be a section 1. The numbers going down the left margin of the page, those will indicate the page number and a line number. The number to the left of the period is always the page number, and the number to the right of the period is the line number. So for example, if someone had a question about page 1, line 12, that would be easy to locate in the bill. This is a way for senators and staff and those following along with the bill to easily refer to a specific place in a bill that might be being discussed. Another way to easily locate information in a bill, especially in a longer or complex bill, would be at the very bottom of the page. And that will always list the article number and the section number that appears on that page, as well as the page number. Within a bill, language can be crossed out and underlined. Language that is crossed out is called stricken language. That is language that is proposed to be removed from existing law. Language that is underlined is proposed to be new language added to the law. So a lot of times you'll see language stricken, and then right after it you'll see language that is underlined. So one way to interpret that is that the old language, the stricken language, would be replaced by the proposed new language. One section of a bill that is important to note is a definition section. Sometimes in a bill, entirely new terms are used, or terms are used that appear elsewhere in law but that are specific to what this section of law or what this bill would apply to. So it's always important to read the definitions in a bill to see how those terms are going to be applied in that particular piece of legislation. At the very end of the bill, especially in a long bill, there will be an appendix, and that'll be an indication of the article numbers and titles and the pages on which the articles first appear. And that's an easy way in a particularly long bill to flip quickly to a particular article.
For more information on bills at the state legislature, follow the link below.